So we're here in Tucson, Arizona, and at the Science of Consciousness conference. And it's been one hell of a week. And I'm here with Dr. Bruce Damer, who is a theoretical biologist based at UC Santa Cruz and also advisor to NASA and a Burning Man veteran.
As you can see.
It's great to have you.
Pleasure, Joshua. Absolutely, yeah.
So perhaps we can begin with your thoughts on the conference so far.
It's a beautiful assemblage of people, going all the way from pure abstract mind state, as we just heard with David Chalmers, like trying to get the whole picture from the most abstract, up here, thing down to deeply embodied people. I'm trying to make the connection between those two poles, right, in a sense, and understand, what consciousness is. Of course, there's no definition of consciousness, but I've had a marvelous time. I think Stuart Hameroff has created a grandiose project 25 years ago, or this is the 25th conference right now in Tucson in its home. So it's a great honor to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So perhaps we can begin with the Burning Man movement. You've been going for decades, I believe.
Since the late 90s. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you see the whole transformational festival movement as typified by Burning Man and its impact on the world and society at large?
Yeah, it's a new flowering. So, there was a festival scene in the mid-'60s that got started with, Drop City in Trinidad, Colorado, and when they tried to build geodesic domes out of car hoods. I have Timothy Leary's news archive, so you see the first attempt to do sort of a festival scene. And then, of course, there was Woodstock, and then there was a rolling, the rock touring festival became a big thing. The US festivals in the 80s, and, all these huge, highly profitable things. But then it had become very commercialized and very direct, producer-driven and company-driven. And then slowly, these little forest-based festivals started, and Burning Man was very small in the early 90s, and it then begat this idea of creating what Hakim Bey called temporary autonomous zones, TAZ, that people could go into to escape the challenges of modern life and the sort of prana-draining aspects of cubicle commuter life. And so they could go out and just be radically self-expressive somewhere. So Burning Man was a Bay Area creation of the web, of the internet, self-organized in a lot of ways. They built a city, and then it really gave permission to make large-scale events. So you have Symbiosis and Lightning in a Bottle in California, big ones. Australia has them, Britain has them, everywhere has them. Yeah. Germany, Holland, South Africa. It's a huge movement now. And I'm missing many countries.
Now, I came across your work, first of all, by your involvement with Terence McKenna. Did you take part in any of his theory development?
A little bit. So I came into contact with Terence toward the end of his life, and we didn't know he was ill. He had a slow-growing brain tumor for possibly decades, because my sister died of the same ailment. So when I came into Terence's life and he came into mine, we exchanged, we swapped places. So I put him into virtual world space, which I was developing in the 90s and organizing the community around, and then he put me into his space, his virtual worlds, and we can then compare notes. And we did sort of a alchemical virtual powwow from his house in Hawaii, and this was in early '99. And then he was diagnosed, and he had a terrible medical incident a couple months later, and then it was just a matter of time. So the community organized around a conference called Alchemical Arts in September '99, really to say goodbye, because the survival odds with this type of brain tumor were small. So after Terence passed, the last time I had with him, I actually saw sort of an escape pod taking Terence away and told him this story. But after he passed, a couple of years went by, and then I thought, well, there's no audio for Terence. So basically a group of us, Ralph Abraham helped, we just pulled all the cassettes we could get together and started digitizing them and booting Terence back up, putting Humpty Dumpty back together. And then I actually got to know him much better because I listened to hundreds of his talks and just fell under his spell of Joycean, silver-tongued Irish speak.
Yeah.
It was just so beautiful. And I really enjoyed the times with him, but they were limited. So at one point, Terence had sort of said, carry it on, keep it going, but tell your own story. And so that's what I've been doing since that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Terence is probably one of, if not the most famous proponent of psychedelics as a tool to elevate the collective consciousness of humanity, which, let's face it, we need desperately at this moment. We're in a crisis state and we don't appear to be living in a sustainable format for the future. And with my own research currently in neuroscience and psychology of mental health, psychedelics seem to provide a very powerful potential tool to help people with all manner of mental health problems. And there's been so many great talks at this event about psychedelic research.
Yeah, beautiful, yeah.
How do you think they could fit into the current model of healthcare and therapy?
Well, here in the US, several of them are getting ready to enter into third stage clinical trials with the FDA. And we could see psilocybin and MDMA as a therapeutic, clinician administered health modality within 4 or 5 years. It could actually happen. So it would re-enter where it had departed in 1985, especially with MDMA. Perhaps LSD is not far behind. So many countries, it's now become a thing to jump on if you're a young investigator or a PI. It's a growing area. There's funding. Research that was shut down for 50 years has come back. Remarkable results. As we saw here, highly energetic, youthful, brilliant principal investigators working on it. Top schools, Johns Hopkins, places like that.
Even Oxford University now. I met a lady last night who's investigating the therapeutic potential of ayahuasca at Oxford University. That was news to me.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Great progress.
Great progress. So it's very hopeful.
Yeah.
We still have to crack the egg of proper set and setting, as Tim had discovered, Tim Leary, but also the containers for integration. The proper containers for this and the proper support for integrating, because if you go into an altered state, whether it be through Vipassana, plant medicine, energy healing work, anything like this, and then you get in your car and drive on the freeway, it blows much of the benefit out of the system. And it actually is a shock to the system, because your system's now tender, wide open, ready to explore a new way of being. And then you just simply are re-entering the society which puts demands upon you. It's very hard to maintain the healing, the ongoing integration, even just an extra day, Ram Dass famously said, think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family, Is that the triggers? He's talking about triggers of deep internal processes. And in a sense, all of this, there's a bigger movement than psychedelics. It's a bigger movement than meditation. It's a bigger movement than all the modalities, which is the discovery of the boot sectors of humanity, the booting up process. And it turns out it's not the only thing that shapes us, but childhood trauma, which can happen at certain ages, happens with certain conditions. This is all in the DSM. Traumas around injury or a traumatic birth experience, traumas around hot, cold love from the caregiver.
By the DSM, you mean the the manual for mental health issues.
Yeah, so they talk about dissociative disorders, they talk about schizoid response, psychopathic response. They all have names, and they're all being now really researched with brain imaging. So somebody will be triggered into a psychopathic controlling where they go unconscious and they start basically the internal force, which in my practice we call a protector, is trying to protect the wound, the psychopathic wound, say a sexual abuse experience. There's a guardian that is blocking to not allow the child to be rewounded. And that guardian or protector can take over and come out and strike. And Eckhart Tolle called this going unconscious. He talked about the pain body. Now we understand that the pain body is multiple types and styles, and that character styles or your personality type is often tied to those initial programmings, wounds, and also genetics and good things that happen to you, good developmental things. But pathology and suffering comes in when the trauma is not addressed and when it's not given a chance to heal or even seen. So people who are coming from trauma, our current so-called president, coming from trauma, very rough upbringing with his father, very abusive.
He lost his brother as well to alcoholism.
Okay.
Quite early on.
So he's running this process where he reacts and strikes all the time. And he's very dissociated and things like this. So we're getting a look at a hardcore case. But they're all through society.
I worked at a drug and alcohol rehab clinic in London for 2 years, and it was probably the most eye-opening experience of my life. I learned not to judge people because these people came in and they'd tell you their life story and the trauma they went through, often childhood neglect and sexual abuse, and you wonder how you would have fared having been through their situation. And then 2 clients came to us that had successfully cured themselves using ibogaine and ayahuasca, and that got me researching down that route of psychedelics because I didn't see the current available therapies that modern medicine has to offer as being especially beneficial, and they're very expensive. So a lot of people seem to regard psychedelics as like a golden source for curing all manner of problems, but I don't quite see it that way. I agree with you that the integration is very difficult, so they might pop out of their default mode network negative thought loops and behavior for several days, but then something will trigger it to come back. And I totally agree with you that perhaps if psychedelics were used in some sort of wisdom tradition or discipline type method would have to be incorporated, be it daily meditation or yoga. And
very importantly, it's almost like people are taking psychedelics without understanding the condition they're treating. They have this vague notion that they have this internal suffering, but until you characterize what that suffering is made out of, how it moves, how it rolls, how it operates, and you see it. If you can see it, if you can get a good clean look at it and feel it and like, and have a knowing of it, then you can take a medicine. But before that, the medicine's just going to go and it's going to stir it up. Of course you'll have a release, emotional release, that kind of thing. But unless you have knowing, that this is the secret to healing. That's why primal scream therapy never worked very well, because people would go into the scream and go into the cycle of the scream and come back and land exactly where they were. There's no observer, no ability to say, the scream's coming, name the scream, like Jack Cornfield talks about. Observe this, hold yourself separate. The scream does itself, or whatever traumatic triggered release comes back, and you see it as an observer, then you have a chance to heal. And only then. But if you're completely taken over, you're taken over by the process. You can't heal from within the storm, from within that.
I did an interview with a lady called Frederica Michael Fischer, who was a psychedelic therapist in Switzerland for the best part of 20 years. And then she went to prison and she came out and wrote a book and lectures about it all over the world.
Oh, wow.
And she used almost every psychedelic that I've ever heard of except ibogaine, and she says that ayahuasca is the most all-round, the number one. But we got in discussion about several cases of people that I know and clients at the rehab clinic, and having heard about their life story, she said that with some people the trauma is so deep that the only way to resolve it is by literally replacing every cell in their body, perhaps in the future through stem cell therapy.
There's another answer to that, in which she's right on the right track. So if you have a schizoid wound or injury, that means that, say, prenatally, or you had a troubled birth, almost asphyxiated at birth, or injury under the age of 2, talk therapy can't reach that. This is why psychotherapy is mostly a failure, talk psychotherapy. So people mask that with SSRIs and things. But the body, it's held in the cells. And in the practice that I'm currently training to be a practitioner in, what we tend to do, it's all energetic work. So somebody with a schizoid response, their field, their consciousness is way out here. And you can't come in and really even touch them, because that creates a threat. You can only sort of touch the field far out and hold the presence and let a bigger thing work their system. And when the system is talked to, the wound is talked to, it erupts. And the bodies tend, for that response, to start to undulate. And they're not in a mental state at all anymore. The body has taken over and is moving. That's the way to get the cellular release of those traumas. So there's a way to do it without replacing every cell. Because we've seen it quite successfully, over time, a person who's allowed to do somatic body release, the system starts to calm and quiet. And then the protector, which is trying to defend that wounded area, softens, and then you can start having a conversation with it. Either a practitioner can, or a person can, like, hello, and then bring it out. It doesn't have to do that job anymore, and then it can become kind of like a superpower. So the person that has a schizoid wound can basically, their consciousness is incredibly mobile, and they develop abilities. So every wound that is healed turns into a kind of a superpower.
I've met many shamans, and one ongoing theme amongst shamans and healers as well is that they often undergo extreme, what can be classified as an array of mental health issues according to conventional medicine, but in their cultures that is a sign that they're a shaman,
that they're evolving, that they're in contact,
and that if they don't answer the call to become a shaman, then it gets worse and worse and worse, and they go into full-blown schizophrenia. And a friend of mine, he's actually a Mexican shaman, and he was struck by lightning as a baby and then fostered, because that was a sign in their village that he's meant to be a shaman. And so he was taken under the wing of a veteran shaman and nurtured from a very young child.
Wow. Yeah, what a different approach, right? Really different approach. And in the old days, in Europe, before this was programmed out of Europe, people who had visions, the most famous example is the mystic, the female mystic, Jeanne d'Arc, right? Visions, talk to spirit, talk to God, whatever, and that was at the point where those kind of mystics were starting to basically be taken out by the Catholic Church. And so that entire thing was decapitated, literally. And so the idea of connection with these realms was no longer permitted in society, especially in the religious hierarchy. So that went underground. But prior to that, European tradition had a great deal of a shamanic type of practice. Before the 13th, 14th centuries. That we literally cut out, we exorcised. And it's come back, right? So you find all these West European types of people that have, it's sort of bubbled up in them again. There's many of them here at this meeting.
To what extent do you think say, schizophrenia or another type of mental health issue is genetic based, like nature based, rather than nurture?
It's probably a combination. Some of them are probably very genetically. Autism, probably. But then there's always a combination. So someone like myself who had a very difficult early experience being given up at birth, I was fairly autistic, and this is the 1960s, and they didn't have a name for this, so it was just, my mother would say, he's in his own world, fine, and so I wasn't treated as a patient ever. I was just accepted. And I had very good, solid parenting, so my condition didn't deepen. And so in my teen years and into my 20s, I had to break out of that. And break out of that complete, like I couldn't make eye contact thing.
So extreme shyness as well.
Yeah, it was, and just could not make eye contact. It was. I think, if there were people walking in the distance, I'd immediately be afraid.
I was similar as a kid. I mean, I could stare at a spider building a web and not move for 3 hours straight. Yeah, I was painfully shy, but also at the same time extremely happy, and everyone used to call me Smiley as a little kid. And then I think adolescence completely disrupted that in good ways in some way and in bad ways in other ways. So I didn't even know that you were a scientist until I met you last year, and apparently you've been working on the theory of the origins of life since you were a kid. And my personal background is microbiology and genetics, so really resonated with you at the MAPS conference. We had a wonderful talk there in the marketplace. I remember that. So how did you get into the origins of life? Because that is perhaps in the top 3 questions in science, with maybe the origin of the universe and what is consciousness. So what made you really focus on the origins of life from such a young age? I was walking out in a place not unlike this, in the dry hills near Kamloops, British Columbia. And in the springtime, there was this, my favorite flower was coming up, the Mariposa lily. They're a three petal flower, and I just loved them. And the ground had just become unfrozen. And I sort of studied that and think, this is such a complex thing, but I know it came from a simple bulb or a seed. There was a simpler structure. So there's some kind of process, and we didn't have computers in our town, so I wasn't using the word algorithm, but there was an algorithm, there was some kind of a mechanism to make this complexity. And then I stood up and thought, then there had to be a common one. Like all of these things had to have a common bulb or seed, metaphorically. I stood up and I looked down the valley, and because of my experience being given up for adoption and kind of being dissociated in the womb, this is what my later work sort of predicts, my consciousness can travel long distances and go all kinds of places. So it went back in time, looking for that common seed. And then I started becoming fascinated, like, how can a jumble of polymers or molecules is thrown in a bucket, in a concentrated way, how can they assemble into something that can make this? And I thought, that is the most fascinating problem. I'd like to work on that. And then the number 90 came into my head. It'll take a long time, it might be 90 before this thing is actually done. So I then committed. So I'm committed to this is what my primary intellectual work will be. The secondary was going to be how to open space for the biosphere, how to allow life to go into the cosmos, which I also committed to when I was 16. So then everything I did from that point was around that. And as I walked back toward the house, suddenly an answer started to come, and I sort of stopped. And I'd read about Albert Einstein doing thought experiments when he was 16, running alongside a beam of light and stuff. I'd sort of heard about it through the grapevine. I thought, okay, that's how science is done. So this delivered thing was coming from some kind of a field, and I always had a connection with that field. Like, there's a bigger system, stuff comes in and out of it, you can be in communication all the time, it can help guide you where to walk, everything. It's a nice resource, you don't have to figure things out,
And then this bundle of molecules that I was trying to picture was like now moving in my third eye. I didn't know what a third eye was. And so I was about to ask it, for the answer. I'm like, hey, you showed up. You're a thought experiment, I'll ask. And it instead asked me a question. It said, figure out how we made a copy of ourselves. And like my little brain went to an automobile, it's a machine, and an automobile factory, and said, well, you need, if you're a machine, you need a big machine to make a copy of a little machine. But I don't see a big machine around you, you're just a bundle of molecules. Like, there's no big machine that made you, so it's not plausible. And it winked, it gave me a nice little, work on it. And so in December of 2013, that's when the egg was cracked. It's like, I was doing breath work, I was going into one of my endo states, because I was at Galen's stepmom's house in Hollywood, looking out over LA, and I did a breathwork session, good yoga, and then it started downloading. And I've been working on this for 38 years. And I'd done many out there, journeys of all kinds looking for this. My PhD had been about this. I'd interacted with people like Stu Kaufman, I'd met Dave Deemer, and Dave Deemer was mentoring me into the chemistry. And so this particular day, my mind started taking the ticklish thought of how do I make a mineral bath in a mineral surface inside a sealed chamber that we can rock back and forth. We can simulate the hot spring environment where we think life started. And boom, I was in the hot spring. So that was the trigger that launched me into this reverie for about half an hour where I saw the whole cycle. The polymers inside the protocell cycling, drying down, dumping their contents into the dry bathtub ring, where they can get synthesized, and then budding off again. And then I saw all the functional polymers starting to be selected. Then I saw colonies of these protocells moving to another pool, getting another stress, inventing a new thing, and bringing it back. Like it was a cross sharing. Then I saw that those colonies were the ancestors of all life, that there wasn't a single individual at the origin of life. It was a community unit in a network operation.
Yeah. Now, so, I've always romanticized the notion of panspermia, life coming from outer space, and your theory, when I heard it for the first time last year, it's got a true elegance to it. Now I hear so many theories, even from world famous scientists, and usually within 20-30 seconds it just doesn't resonate with me, and I reject it. But with your theory, it's incredibly elegant and
it works experimentally.
Yeah.
So Dave, being a membrane biophysicist, had already got wet-dry cycling to make polymers without enzymes. It's this technical kind of language, but basically like bubble bath soap. You put bubble bath soap in your bath, and it stabilizes the bubbles, so they're around longer, so they're floating on the surface. If you drain your tub and dry it down, those bubbles squeeze down and they can actually fuse. Now, air-filled bubbles generally pop, but water-filled bubbles start fusing, and you get a bathtub ring. And you can see this in any pond, anywhere on the planet.
Like pond scum.
Pond scum, lipids, even the foam in ocean.
And
spray.
The lipids you mentioned are available all over the planet naturally from meteorite
sources. Not only lipids, but amino acids, which are building blocks, and nucleobases also come in from space in copious amounts. So we didn't need a way to make those. We just needed a way to stitch them together. And so in the early Earth, say 4.1 billion years ago, there's been studies done now that suggest that there was 100 million to 1 billion times the infall that we see today from this dust. We see it all the time, right? Yeah. Meteor showers and things, but it was immense. It was like almost a snow. And feeding these pools on land driven by hot springs, they had this wonderful property of regular filling. So think Old Faithful. So if I was to build a laboratory chemical...
Filling, but by filling you mean they evaporated when it was hot in the day, and then at night the condensation would... Okay.
And they could fill through dew formation, diurnal cycling, but regular geyser filling. Super clockwork. That's what you need. So in the lab, if I was to polymerize and try to make these biopolymers, we would just do it on a clockwork basis with a certain time so that the polymers didn't break down when they were wet. And we got more of them because we were dry soon enough, because water breaks things down. It's the solvent. And so here you have it, the hot spring. In Yellowstone alone, there's hundreds of hot springs that have predictable eruption times. So you have this field of it's like nature's chemistry set. But it does this thing of filling the pools, allowing them to dry down and synthesize their polymers, go into protocells, and select from trillions upon trillions of protocells. And then the protocells have a little bit more function the next time. It's like a rolling of a dice over and over. And these pools are, hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of years, these hydrothermal systems. It would have been all over volcanic landscapes on the early Earth. Because the early Earth was just a great big jacuzzi, practically. I mean, it was the crust was cooling, and there was volcanism everywhere, and hot spots everywhere.
And for your model, RNA and DNA didn't appear to evolve into that equation to a much later date, correct?
Well, we're now in a whole revolution on that, because we self-assemble RNA-like things with drying. Our laboratory has just self-assembled DNA. So a double-stranded helical DNA polymer out of the monomer, one monomer of DNA. And that's about to be sent to publication. That'll be world news. It'll just be the shot heard around the world. That means DNA is just as self-assemblable, just as the little fatty acid membranes, just as the RNA is, just as the peptides are. So they're all three there. All the players on the stage of life can be present. And we can test this empirically. So we can actually potentially have a short strand of DNA, which when the hot water enters the pool, will melt it. Will separate the strands. And that's called PCR. That's how we sequence genomes. And then the water's cooling down again, or maybe only partially separated. Or if it fully separates, it can template and make 2 copies of that piece of DNA. If it partially unwinds, perhaps it can make a product that has a functional effect. So it's like a simplest, absolutely straw man reaction that we can build. We can design an experiment working backwards, see if this works. And if we see more of those DNA short strands, we've done it. Because the system has stably, there was a random piece of DNA, or maybe we ordered one from a catalog that we knew what it would do. And then we see 2 in the next round, or you see an amplification, 2x of them, then something is allowing them to return to the cycle where they're melted and then templated and replicated. So this is all testable, very, very elegant but short, low-cost experimentation.
I think you know what the next question is going to be about. We're at the science of consciousness. So where does consciousness come into play with your theories? I mean, is it, as Deepak Chopra would say, does it imbue all and everything in the whole universe, or is a biological substrate needed, in which case, at which stage of evolution of your model does consciousness suddenly emerge?
I think the most parsimonious, simplest models are always best. And the simplest model is if you have a complex phenomenon, it needs a substrate to run on. So a smartphone user interface needs a bunch of hardware and services and all kinds of things working correctly to make it work. And same thing with consciousness. So the living world is powerful enough to do more than primate consciousness, and we're just a really small subset. So our minds, can't create. We create reality through our hands and through our ideas, but we have limited agency in the world.
So on this planet, at least, a biological organism is required for consciousness. And how about beyond this planet?
It's dead.
Completely dead.
Well, Mars, where we're going in 2.5 years with Mars 2020, and I'm on one of the landing site selection teams. It's a pretty terrible place. It's super dry, and if you're standing there, the feeling of being there, I mean, the astronauts on the moon, desiccated, they call it magnificent desolation, but there's total deadness. So and billions of years of static, no change, on the lunar surface, and Mars too, dust storms. If life is anywhere, it's deep in the crust, because Mars went out of the habitable zone, so if it ever had life had to escape.
I always felt it was a little naive to be searching for life outside of the Earth by trying to find planets with the Goldilocks, the perfect environment with the perfect atmospheric constituents and water
Mars,
and oxygen.
Mars had an Earth-like setting for about 1 billion years. It had shallow seas, it had rainfall, it had hydrothermal systems. It had a clement environment, so it had liquid water on the surface. Didn't have a moon, didn't have a big magnetic core, couldn't protect the loss of its atmosphere. So it went to desiccation and then perchlorate soils and deadness, So if life actually started, say, around a hot spring on Mars, which is what we think we found at Columbia Hills with the Spirit rover, if it started at the hot spring, it could escape down into the pipes of the hot spring and still be there. So that's why we want to drive up to the outcrops at Columbia Hills and try to break the rocks and look for those stromatolitic rock textures. So it may be, quote unquote, past life on Mars, or that it's life in the refugia that we can't get at. But it's a needle in a haystack. And it's even worse for Enceladus, the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, because you have this deep ocean capped with 30 kilometers of ice, and you may have hot vents, but you can't start the biochemistry at the vents because of hydrolysis and the lack of ability to have membranous compartments. So the field mostly has turned away from an ocean as an origin, because we took seawater, when we took our Yellowstone water, acid and alkaline, shook it up made vesicles, made the little protocells. Then Dave took seawater off of Santa Cruz, and it crystallized the whole system. There was no way to make compartments. So there's no compartments, there's no selection, no cellularity ever. And so the ocean is a caustic and extremophile environment that life has to adapt to later. Chemically, it's not a Goldilocks zone.
We've discussed what I consider a very rational, logical approach to the origins of life. I was expecting something a little bit more far-fetched, to be honest. But you finished your lecture yesterday talking about synchronicity. And how does that incorporate into your...
Well, here's the challenge that I was set by Stuart Hameroff when he invited me last year, was that I set for myself, is how can the origin of life help us understand what consciousness is? So I said, well, seems to me, and I never cracked a book on consciousness. I looked into them. It's a lot of words, right? It's a big phenomena. It's very hard to study. So if you're trying to study forest ecology and you're in the middle of a forest and you can only see a few trees, that's the example where we're at. It's a big system, huge system. So I thought, unwind life back to its start point, see how it can start, and then find the fundamental properties of the living world, and then wind them up, the properties, and see how they create something that you could call consciousness. And so I did a thought experiment 1.5 years ago and was shown, as usual, the system. There's a cranky guy, a cranky thought experiment this time. So I asked it, is it necessary to have a white bearded guy standing next to the first protocells and saying, well, let's move this carbon atom 5 angstroms to the left? And the thought experiment said, no, that's an unnecessary complication. Let me show you how you were made. And showed me the properties of the membranous protocell. Crowding polymers is tweaking probability. That's what it does. It's physical, right? So something wiggles into the membrane or finds it, and it's more likely to react with other things that are crowded in there. Like we're at a conference, we're crowded together. When two protocells are together, when there's a population, then messages are going between them, between their lumens, and physics can't do that. It doesn't do message passing. We're doing it here by having a conversation. Then the third thing, if you get enough protocells and enough message passing, you create a network. The network is powerful enough to create a memory system. So you get a little short polymer
Is this
initially.
based on the theory of mirror neurons?
No, this is all just basic biochemistry.
Okay.
So what we're doing here is we're crowded together, we're communicating, we're making a record that will be shared with other people that then can take that information and build on that. This is the fundamental drivers of the living world. Probability increases because it can generate interconnections and messages which write memories, write scripts, which then make things more probable because it's got a blueprint to work from the next time, and things ratchet up. And that's what we see here around the planet. And life is much more productive than the cosmos. So that's why it's a dead cosmos. It only has two-phase cycling, has no memory system. Can't find it. So you can't have consciousness if you have no memory, if you have no templates. Right? It's just ludicrous. So the cosmos has 13 billion years just to create the periodic table and a bunch of minerals. Not very productive. It's impressive. But as soon as you get life started, you get all this complexity, these barrel cactuses, us, lunch, technology, and spiritual experience. And what I held out for the meeting yesterday was this PIM thing generates everything. So it was the answer to my question. It generates all spiritual experience, consciousness, biology, technology, etc.
Okay.
That there's nothing outside of that cycling system that cannot be explained with everything can be explained with those three properties, just in a continuous Taoist cycle.
PIM stands for
Probability, interactivity or interconnection, and memory.
Okay.
And everything is based on that. And you can look at it in that barrel cactus. You can look at social media. The way it works is PIM. And Deepak's practice, everybody, what these people believe academically, the mental structures they create, it's all made by this generative system. So I propose that this is a new Copernican center. So Copernicus was the Polish astronomer who figured out that planets went around the sun. Luckily he died, he published this posthumously so he didn't lose his funding or his head. But Galileo got in trouble for it. But it was suggested to me a year or two ago that the discovery, if we can prove it, that this generative system is the generative system for all this. And it's real low level, but it's operating on a continuous basis. That's a new Copernican revolution for the next 500 years.
So would it be safe to say that you think the current models, standard models of, say, the periodic table of elements for chemistry, the standard model of particle physics, and the four fundamental forces are sufficient to explain everything, including consciousness? Or do we need to find...
I think they are. They're the substrate on which this PIM thing operates, right? So that system needs a substrate like everything else. But really the system that drives it is the rotation of the planet Earth sunward and nightward. That is the system which is the master cycler. If you took the Earth out of the solar system with some accident, this would crash instantaneously. It'd just go away, and we're exquisitely dependent on that cycling. And so it's hubris to think otherwise, because we feed our bodies and we go to sleep and we live 60, 70, 80, 90 years, and then we're taken out, right? I think death is the ultimate, teacher about an attitude of hubris. But the idea is that you can ratchet up away from equilibrium, away from physics. But physics is very rich. But biology and this complexity made by this progenote, in a sense, is much richer, much more complex than what physics can do.
I got in a discussion 2 years ago with Deepak where he was commenting that in certain cases of Alzheimer's, I asked him people that towards the latter stages of Alzheimer's, about 8% of people, their brain is like utterly decayed and they're in a vegetative state, but then just before dying, in the day before or the week before, they achieve terminal lucidity. And he started talking about, because consciousness imbues everything, and looking in the brain for consciousness is like looking in the TV for the person that appears on the TV. And then I mentioned, like, so basically the deeper we probe into reality and consciousness using mind and machine, the greater we seem to extend its fractal geometric complexity. So our consciousness is creating reality and materializing it into what we can touch and feel.
And of course, that's the ultimate statement of hubris, right? Because human consciousness is so fallible. You know, it's so limited. It's limited in the olfactory sense. It's reasonably good in vision, but we're very narrow range. We're evolved to do certain things. So at the end of my dream, the operator of the dream grabbed my shirt collar after I was shown how we were made and said, "You listen, and you listen good. You monkeys have only just now started sensing this enormous field made by the living world, winding up all these properties, which is primarily driven by it's a probability shaping machine. So your intention and your attention and sticking with it and taking action can shape your future path. And it's a powerful tool. It's the most powerful tool you'll ever have. However, don't stop short. Don't name this thing prematurely. Don't analyze it. Don't monetize it. Whatever. Go and experience it. Open your systems, your exquisitely designed instruments by evolution to measure this field. And you're the best science instruments you'll ever have is your bodies, heart, mind, whatever body. Is to go in but don't build your simple cartoon models. Just go and explore.
I'd like to add maybe that voice in your dream that said "you monkeys" was actually referring to Western civilization rather than like indigenous tribes and people.
Right. Now they have a completely different connection, right, with the field and nature. They don't come in with mental structure, with understanding and,
I recall
science.
That at Boom Festival 2 years ago, there was a talk by various indigenous tribes, and there was a guy from the Hunikui tribe in Brazil, a shaman, and he said, in our tribe we don't even have words for anxiety and depression. It does not exist. And there was this, he was so extremely present that I looked him in the eye and it was like looking into the eyes of a wild animal. And we just don't see that.
Someone is here. They're here. They're not lost in thought. So our big, the Enlightenment gave us tremendous power to be in thought and mastery of the world, but then it dissociated us. And what we're seeing at this conference is massive amount of dissociation. Right. The talk we just came out of was extremely dissociated.
I like to too much intellect. It's like there's not enough heart involved, and like in the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, too much mustard, he calls it.
Too much mustard. And if you're talking about consciousness, you're not coming from an embodied experience of it. You're not talking about the thing you're studying. And so I think, in a sense, for somebody to talk about consciousness, they have to become fully embodied in this world, and they can then speak from that space, that place. But to talk from a dissociated mental model that's very abstract is a real disservice, and it's also taking people in a rabbit hole, a goose chase.
I'd like to add a mutual friend of ours, Gino Yu. I first met him 2.5 years ago, and I was utterly fascinated with consciousness, debating whether to go back to university to study neuroscience, which I've done now. And he said to me, instead of chasing this vision, wondering about consciousness all the time, it's better to be conscious. And that really struck me.
I had the most wonderful time with Gino in Hong Kong in November. We went up on the peak, and we just went into a present state. It was so beautiful, because he has this eye-gazing technique, right, of complete presence. And after a while with Gino, you start noticing everything. You can hear voices everywhere. And then Gino pointed out, when we first did this, it's all connected. If we're having a thought about relationship, the person over there is going to start talking about relationship, and the person over there will answer the question that they answered, but they don't hear each other. It's a choreographed, interconnected field. And then your system goes like this. Then you merge with the field, right? So it's just wonderful.
I must say, I was with him at the World Economic Forum this year, and it's like riding a roller coaster of synchronicities.
Yeah.
Yeah, with him and certain other people I know.
Yeah, and here too. I mean, my goodness. So, and we're getting better and better and better at this stuff, and our phones are helping, and we're just getting so good at this, you know. And I think we're chafing at the bit a bit, you know. But we don't quite know what's going on. But I think it's the probability engine. It's waking up. We're waking up in it, and it's all waking up at once. So life is big, 4.5 billion years of evolution. It's a massive system. Don't need to look elsewhere. It's all around us. Be here, and we sense what we are. So sometimes I ask the cosmos, like, dear cosmos, were you actually considering, or was this your intent for us to reach this point and not know where to go? So then I ask it for help. Like, can you like help a big cosmic being with your big spaceships and your whatever, wherever you are, come and help us out. But what always happens, instead of the spaceship landing and Frito-Lay trucks going out to meet it and things like this, something just happens right in the present. A person walks by and, oh, hey, Bruce, how you doing? That's how it's delivered. It's here and now in our field, in this moment. That's how it always operates. Everything else is a distraction, it's dissociation, it's imagination. It's like, so even if you ask the cosmos, you make a server request, what comes back is a thing happens just in the 5 minutes. And it just, because it has to manifest through this. And not through some abstract thing. This is the field. This is consciousness. This is the synchronicity right here, right now. All these plants and us and our gut biome and our 4.5 billion year old origins, our ancestry rolling through our bodies. And you know, the slide I showed yesterday as a closing thought. Well, we went from the spiraling from the simple cosmos up through memory, through neurons, through brain. And then we got to this point of consciousness. And what does consciousness do? It becomes aware of itself. And this is all the great spiritual teachers. When you get to the point, consciousness aware of itself. Only consciousness can understand or experience, see consciousness. Not mind, not all these formulas. Only consciousness. So when you're in a really fully conscious state, you can now have it look back on itself. And when it looks back on itself, and in my case, looks back on the union of all life, or because I can see and feel in my body the origin, I live there, then it wraps around and sort of I have this toroidal structure, right, coming down, and like, then it becomes unity with all, as Deepak experienced, he talks about. And then I transformed it to the Alex Gray with the person in the chakras to say, this is us. This is us when we do this work, and it's the whole body, you notice, but it's this whole, there's a field that's going out, and that's how we depict it in art. I'm feeling it right now, you know, and that's what I wanted to, so I could bring from the reductionist material, mechanistic origins, try to tell them the story with cartoons and explanation and fun science all the way to this unity experience, you know, and primarily, it operates because it has massive interconnections, massive memory, and massive ability to shape probability instantaneously. So synchronicities, miracles, and the unity consciousness experience can come. It's all one. It's all one OS that's running it all.
So perhaps as a final topic to discuss, the planet is clearly in crisis due to the
us.
Us. What message could you share with listeners about how to possibly go elevate their conscious awareness and help realize a sustainable future for humanity and the planet?
It's happening all around us. So it's already happening. People are caring for their bodies better, their food. They're realizing, those that aren't entrapped in this crazy media system, so the crazy fake news, anxious news, the manipulators of message. People are tuning out more and more And the younger generation is very wise to it.
Yeah.
So you meet a millennial,
Mm-hmm.
and they've been brought up with smartphones. Some of them, as my millennial friends, they're like, "Ah," their whole system's totally tweaked by it. But they say the other 23-year-olds that they're our best friends, they're like, something comes into them through the news, hits their system, and they have a crystal ability because they've absorbed so much, and they go, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So they hear some stupid thing from the so-called president or something, and they go, yeah, right. So they're instantly able to evaluate, discard crap. Like, and it's almost like their conscious awareness is so high.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they're coming in.
So they have ability to rationalize information better rather than just fall into the trappings of fear
Marketing
and doubt and marketing.
being sold to and things like that. A percentage of them.
Yeah.
And so those are powerful beings, right? Because they've established a separate identity from the nonsense in the culture. They can move, and we need to help them. This is the primary thing we need to do, is help them.
I find probably the most gravitational model which is underlined by the current socio-economic engine is getting stuck in the rat race of believing that, you know, you earn enough money, you'll be in,
the whole crazy
you'll find happiness,
hyper-normalization thing.
And that illusion is becoming more apparent to everyone.
It's becoming transparent, and some of them fall into it, but I meet them all the time when I go to the festivals. Some of them are kind of lost, some of them are very present and very aware. They don't have economic directions, some of them. If we can help them, I mean, they're going to replace us pretty soon. We can really help them with wisdom and grounding and say, you are right, it is bullshit. And you have wisdom and you have power and strength in your numbers, and you are trained to school, you're trained to be in group. Unlike any previous generation, they're in a group. They move as a group, they're like schooling fish, I notice. And, you know, trying to, in a sense, mentor them, give them sort of wizardry, Jedi type fun things to say, you can be the Jedi and cut through. You can manipulate probability and outcome, and create a kind of a school for them to take their inner power. Like, you are really good at smartphones and social media. You can create an entire viral movement in a day. And so to really, it's them we need to be giving to as much as everything we've got.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot to learn from indigenous tribes. One in particular comes to mind, a tribe in Colombia. I forgot their name, but they refer to themselves as the elder brother and consider their tribe as the guardians of nature, like the shepherds of nature. And I feel like humanity as a species, we have this self-awareness and conscious level that is unparalleled in the natural kingdom, and it should be our duty to shepherd nature.
Yeah, and so we go and millennials go down, connect with them deeply, videotape, make short, digestible, viral, them talking. Like, this is a plant, it feeds you, it kind of, but it has a spirit, and doing some fantastic media production, and then just send it out. And that could be done really quickly, and then everybody's looking at that, wow, that is a human being in their environment telling us what it is, and look at their eye, look at their, so that could be spread and shared with all of humanity rather quickly, by a skilled person like yourself, for example.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure, pleasure's mine. Yeah. I'm glad we did this after.
Yeah, great stuff.